Fantastic. Welcome everyone to this seventh Engage webinar, the European Union's Indo-Pacific Strategy, a blueprint for effective external action. My name is Gustavo Miller. I'm a researcher at the 11th Center for Global Governance Studies at K11 in Belgium, and I will be moderating this debate. The 11th Center for Global Governance Studies is part of the Engage consortium. Engage is an Horizon 2020 project that looks into how the EU can effectively and sustainably meet strategic challenges by utilizing all of its tools of external action and by consequence become a more assertive global actor. In a few weeks' time, the Engage project will publish a white paper on European Union's external action, compiling more than 3 years of insightful research and turning it into useful and actionable policy recommendations for the European Union to recalibrate its role and place in the world. We can know more about Engage and its upcoming white paper and various insightful policy briefings by checking its website, that is engage-eu.eu, and subscribe to its newsletter. Now to today's topic. The Indo-Pacific region is arguably the world's center of gravity in political, economic, and security terms. It has emerged as a focal point in the escalating geopolitical rivalry between China and the United States. Home to the world's two most populous countries, the region is also important in global trade and value chains. While the region holds significant weight in economic affairs, it's also a theater of increasing security challenges. The assertiveness of China, exemplified by tensions over Taiwan and maritime claims in the South China Sea, pose also complex security risks in a global competition with the United States. In this Engage webinar, we'll delve into the European Union's Indo-Pacific strategy, unveiled in 2021, which aims at navigating this delicate balance between commercial interests and security imperatives, and how the EU streamlined its approach to the region. Now, this approach includes, in addition to an attempt to de-risk the Union's relations with China, a term that has been picked up by other actors, even if it's yet to be fully clarified. In parallel, the European Union also has its Global Gateway initiative that seeks to enhance connectivity with the Asia-Pacific region, which further illustrates its commitment to a strategic presence in the region. Now, to unpack this development and explore whether the EU's strategy serves as an effective blueprint for external action in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, we are joined by three experts. Professor Gulshan Sachdeva is Professor in European Studies and Coordinator at the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India. Julia Turkovic, who shall be rejoining us momentarily, is Assistant Director at the Center for Security and Diplomacy and Strategy at the Free University of Brussels in Belgium. And Gunnar Wiegand is Visiting Professor at the College of Europe and at Sciences Po Paris. He was, up until very recently, Managing Director for Asia and the Pacific at the European External Action Service. Thank you all three for being with us today. I suggest that we start with Gunnar, followed then by Julia. By the time she should be back with us after experiencing some technical problems. And we're going to then finish with a view from the region itself, from India, with Gulshan. Each of our panelists will give an initial talk of around 8 minutes. That will be followed by a Q&A. You, the audience, you can ask questions via the Q&A button that you find at the bottom of your screen. Now, first come, first served. Please also identify yourself and tell us who the question is addressed to. Without further ado, let me then move on to Gunnar Wiegand. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Gustavo, for this opportunity. I will try to be perhaps a bit more of an observer than a senior official, which is not so easy when you're still the first year of retirement. I do believe that the EU has started to make a sincere effort to do what you described at the beginning, to use all means which the EU possesses to position itself more geostrategically conscious with the means it has in this very wide and contested area. We have our China strategy, we have our policy towards Japan and Korea, we have our India policy, but we didn't have a policy covering the area, the wide area from the east coast of Africa to the Pacific Islands. That is new, and it was established in 21 upon, I have to say, strong insistence of several of our member states. So it was not originally a European Commission and High Representative initiative, and comprises the 7 main areas which I have to recall. Prosperity, so that's essentially the FTA and unilateral market access instruments area. Green transition, ocean governance, digital governance and partnerships. Connectivity, where Global Gateway plays, of course, an important role. Security and defense, which was a new addition because in all the other areas the EU was in one way or another already active. And finally, human security, which is essentially humanitarian activities. I'm glad to say that the political impetus has been maintained and is very visible by the fact that we have now had, and Indian Minister Jaishankar, for example, participated twice in these ministerial fora. In February 2022, just a few days before the Russian aggression against Ukraine started in Paris, and then late last year in Stockholm in May, and then again this year in Brussels in February, we had ministerial fora, Indo-Pacific ministerial fora. There were not less than 70 participants this year, including from several Pacific states and several African states. And these are fora where progress in all these areas is being looked at, but where, frankly, there is not the intention to negotiate over weeks or months highly complex joint statements, but where action in concrete ways is at the forefront of the discussions. And they focused last time in open discussions on the greening of the economies and on the prosperity of the participants by liberalizing further trade and on the security challenges. This, for me, shows that there's continued strong interest in a partner who continues to say that we want to be inclusive and not exclusive, and that we want to be basing our approach on cooperation and not on confrontation and on block creation. This may astonish some, but it is based on the simple assumption that the European Union, which is strongly connected trade and investment-wise, but also in terms of people-to-people connections in research and innovation, in particular, with so many countries, that we want to have a engagement which brings people, which brings states, which brings economies closer together. And this does not preclude that we have in individual bilateral relationships, as, for example, we have seen with India over the last few years, with the resumption of the FTA negotiations, investment negotiations, with the start of the Trade and Technology Council, significant bilateral moves forward, but that we also try to bring together as many partners as possible along these 7 action areas. So I will not go further into detail, but of course I can be challenged in this assessment. I do think there's a market for the cooperative approach. I do think that there's a need for the areas I described. And let me just finish by one observation, because I know that security and defense is always upmost in the mind, and at a time when we have a war in Ukraine, at the time when we have a war in the Middle East, again, with a high risk of escalation, of course, there is a lot of attention needed for dealing with this and the consequences of it. And what happens in the Red Sea has, of course, also a direct consequence for our trade with the whole Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific area. But in this situation, where these significant security challenges are there, we have also a number of actions started to increase the security engagement of the EU collectively. But I want to draw your attention also to the fact that member states individually do this also, because after all, they are having the armed forces and they are having the defense industries. So while we are doing with our EU operation in the Indian Ocean, Atalanta, and with a new coordinated maritime presence, we have joint exercises with port visits, including Indian and other nations' navies. We do have a situation where one member state, France, has significantly increased its defense industry cooperation with India. And I saw the latest Indian statistics, which show that while Russia, unfortunately, is still by far the largest partner of India, with, I think, almost 60% or even more than that, of defense procurement. The US is at 7% and France is at 7%. That is one of the examples. The other example is the participation of French and German air forces at major air force exercises in Australia last year, and it will happen again this year. And the third example is that it's a very small example, but nevertheless, it's about presence. And presence not only from France as a regional actor, as a territorial actor in the Indo-Pacific, which has military bases and has military personnel in the region, but also that there are German and Dutch ships going this year on several months-long tour through the Indo-Pacific. So there are concrete steps which member states are undertaking on top of, in addition to the collective actions of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gunnar, for this initial intervention, and also for mentioning the role of the member states therein. If I'm not mistaken, the three that you mentioned, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, also had their own Indo-Pacific strategy prior to the Union's document itself. So this is also very good to be recalling that. Without further ado, let me then pass on the floor to Julia, who has rejoined us. Julia, for your initial talk, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Gustavo, and apologies. Internet went down here at the VUB, so I had to find a quick solution, but okay, I'm here, and thanks a lot to you, Gustavo, but also to the entire Engage team for the invitation. It's always interesting and nice to discuss EU Indo-Pacific approach, especially with two great speakers here in the panel today. So you ask in your title to actually, the point seems for this discussion to also assess the effectiveness. And so I thought when we want to assess effectiveness, we usually have to start, take a step back and discuss, okay, but what was the initial objective for this strategy? And so I think it's useful sometime to take a step back and reflect again on what was the process that took us there and the reflections that guided us towards the process before it reached the point of the EU adopting an Indo-Pacific strategy. And I'm sure, and sorry, Gunnar, for missing the your initial points, but I'm sure you already touched upon some of those. So I'll try to be brief. So in April 2021, EU head of states and government adopted the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. But the question is, why the EU wanted to step up its role in the Indo-Pacific region in 2021? So this discussion started, and I think it's important to remember this, started during the COVID-19 pandemic. France adopted its Indo-Pacific strategy already in 2018, then it revised it in 2021. But then the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic created a bigger interest around the Indo-Pacific region by other two important states, Gustavo, as you mentioned, Germany, the Netherlands, but also other European states that were interested in a greater engagement of Europe in the region, again, following what happened in 2021 and the discussions that follow. Before that, the Indo-Pacific region was not one of the core priorities of EU external action. In fact, in the 2016 global strategy, it was a rather peripheral topic. Of course, ASEAN was mentioned and so on, but was not really central, despite the fact that US, for example, already rebalanced its strategies towards Asia and the Pacific in 2018 with Obama. But Europe still in 2016 with the global strategy was not seeing the region as one of its core priorities. So what happened and what pushed for this change? So I think, and of course, is that for some member states, this was a good opportunity for Europe to realign a bit with US after Trump. And so they de facto used the Indo-Pacific to relaunch a bit transatlantic relations. So was maybe not such a direct priority for some of the member states. For some others on the opposite spectrum, was they saw this debate exactly to state some sort of strategic autonomy and offer a European way to deal with the growing US-China competition in the region. So overall, I think it's important to also ask ourselves again, what was the initial objectives? And still, we don't know. And maybe there were different and different objectives that lead us there. In terms of priorities, there were a quite interesting shift from a traditional shift, a focus on trade. There was a much bigger attention on security, but also in terms of partnership, ASEAN is traditionally the primarily point of contact, let's say, of Europe in the region, but still in the Indo-Pacific strategies are there like-minded partners were mentioned, being Japan, being Australia or Korea. And after all that, after the strategy in 2021, Russia invasion of Ukraine changed the debate a bit. And there were some analysts suggesting that this would mean a shift in policymaker attention and a reorder again of EU strategic priorities to then focus again back to the neighborhood. And so that all this attention towards the region was actually not useful and over, but actually this didn't happen. And I think this is another interesting element when we assess the effectiveness of this engagement. It's interesting to see that against bigger challenges, and we saw Russian invasion of Ukraine. We see now tensions and in the Middle East. Still, the EU remain engaged with the region, and most importantly, I think the region also remain engaged with Europe. And all this, I think, some of the elements that are interesting to notice are that, first of all, like-minded partners like Australia, Japan, Korea, they really supported the EU's efforts in Ukraine under the famous motto of Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, Ukraine today might be East Asia tomorrow. So this really served and supported the engagement of countries in the Indo-Pacific on Ukraine, and at the same time suggested that Europe should also remain involved in the region exactly because of this linkage. It's also interesting to notice that in terms of the security debate, this went beyond Europe and beyond European Union, but still involving Europe and member states. And so this happened via NATO, and the fact that Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, New Zealand were invited to participate to the NATO summit for the first time. This also showed, again, a continuous engagement with the region beyond, again, the traditional trade focus. And I think what is important, and I'll try to conclude here, and then I'm sure we will debate this. I think it's important when, again, we discuss when we try to think about an assessment of what will come in the future again, I think there are some elements that will be important and interesting to look on. One is how to keep this cooperation with like-minded partners that grow so much in such a short time. So again, Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, how to continue the engagement with those countries and what's the right venue for this type of engagement. So far, the G7, for example, proved to be quite an effective gathering to discuss priorities for this group, but not all countries are involved in these discussions. So what's the right venue? That's, I think, one of the elements that will also show us the future of the EU engagement with the region and with countries in the region. Second, how to make this cooperation future-proof, in particular keeping an eye on the other side of the Atlantic and the upcoming elections in the US. How can we make this cooperation even stronger and make sure future changes will not impact Europe or partners in the regions in way that we prefer to not to be impacted. And then second, so far I focus mainly on the like-minded partners, but not all countries in the Indo-Pacific are like-minded, and they are very different. I mean, Gulshan will build on India, which is a very interesting case, a very important partner for Europe, but as you also pointed out, Gustavo, is also quite close to Russia still. So how to engage with countries like India while also keeping an eye at growing challenges of further cooperation between China and Russia, for example. How can we relate with countries like India? How can we discuss these big changes with countries like India? And then what about all the others? What about all those that are in the Pacific regions but are not necessarily like-minded, and actually also in terms of Ukraine, for example, move a bit away from Europe? So how can we remain engaged with them? And finally, and I'll conclude here, I think for the future, Europe should also try to be, in a sense, more convincing in its role in the Indo-Pacific. Sometimes it seems partners there are more positive about the role that Europe could play, but Europe tends to kind of limit itself in the role that it can play in the region. And again, in order to be a bit more bold there, I think it's important for Europe, again, to understand the connections between European security and the region. That is, sure, it's geographically far away, but the consequences there are consequences that are very important for Europe as well, in terms of traditional security, but also in terms of economic impact, and all the discussions about now semiconductors, Taiwan, economic security also show that Europe will be impacted by whatever might happen in the Indo-Pacific region. I'll stop here. Thanks a lot, and looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Julia, for let's say populating the map with all these actors that you also described. And the region is certainly very diverse. As you say, the like-minded countries, Japan, South Korea, but there are also institutions, right? And thank you for mentioning institutions such as Asian, but also the role that NATO has been playing, particularly in the security field. We're probably going to come back to those ideas also during the Q&A. Now let me move on then to one of those not so like-minded partners, and yet partners should be considering this strategy, to India, with Professor Gulshan Sachdeva. The floor is yours for the initial intervention.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gustavo. I'm really honored to be part of this very distinguished panel. This concept of Indo-Pacific is still evolving. Although we do have some very concrete forums like, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Quad, or this Trilateral Security Pact between Australia, UK, and the US, the AUKUS, and also the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But to me, at the moment, it's still a narrative, but a very powerful narrative. In fact, the last few years, the foreign policy debates in a number of countries in the region has been greatly influenced by the Indo-Pacific narrative. And the core of this Indo-Pacific powerful narrative is how to really balance the rise of assertive China. Now, depending on their own strategic and economic interests, countries have defined their own Indo-Pacific geographies. As Mr. Wigan mentioned about the way EU looks at Indo-Pacific, and many other countries have also looked at their own geography of Indo-Pacific. But at this point of time, I think we don't need to be bothered too much about that particular aspect. But due to the nature of the narrative, I think the major focus has been on the strategic matters within the region so far. But apart from strategic importance, I think all major powers have also recognized that the Indo-Pacific region will also be an economically dynamic region. So as a result, many even outside powers, they have also been attracted toward the Indo-Pacific discussions. In fact, you have IPEF, where many countries are participating, and the EU and many of its member states, they have also come out with their own Indo-Pacific visions and strategies. But apart from strengthening economic cooperation, we also need to be equally concerned about sustainability issues. The high economic growth in the region would also be happening within the context of rising geopolitical competition and also contested connectivity strategies. Therefore, despite these pressures, the Indo-Pacific region also need to be equally focused on 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and also on the Paris Agreement on the climate change. And most countries in the region are also densely populated. They are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change. And the discussions on these issues and effort to build cooperative mechanism on sustainability within the Indo-Pacific, I think to many people, maybe far more important than the immediate security concern. So within this broader context, I think if I look at the EU strategy and also what the Indian approach to Indo-Pacific is and where do they really have to really work together. Now, I think both are very important, I see, India and also the European Union. Now, India is important for a couple of reasons. First, its important role within the Indian Ocean, and Indian Ocean is a key component of the Indo-Pacific construct. And secondly, like compared to all countries in the Quad or AUKUS, India is not an alliance partner of the US. Most Europeans also work within the NATO security framework under the leadership of the US. So whatever happens or doesn't happen within the Indo-Pacific forums, if there is a serious security concern anywhere in the world, including in the Indo-Pacific, all of them will come together anyway. We have seen this in Afghanistan. We have seen this in Ukraine. We are also seeing to some extent also in the Middle East. So when the US decided to go to Afghanistan, all of them, including Europeans, they went to Afghanistan whether they liked it or not. Similarly, currently in Ukraine, when economic sanctions are announced by the US and Europe, Japan, Australia, they immediately followed. As you know, despite Indian policymakers repeatedly asserting about rule-based international order, national sovereignty and territorial integrity of states at so many meetings at different Indo-Pacific forums, Indian perceptions about Ukraine war are different from Europe, and India is reacting differently. And of course, many in Europe and US were also initially disappointed because they thought that India would be, as a close strategic partner, will be aligning with them. So coming to the EU strategy, its guidelines, and also approaches from different member states, from Germany, France, Netherlands, and some of the new ones from Lithuania and others, and also to broadly even cover the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt. So while if you look at carefully all these European approaches and strategies, it's quite clear that I think the European approach to Indo-Pacific is slightly different, and they want to deal the China issue in a different manner. And that's the reason I would say that India also must evaluate European approach very, very carefully, because how to deal with China is one of the major foreign policy challenge for every country, including India and many of the in Europe. So everybody is trying to figure out how to deal with rising and assertive China. That since if that is the central construct, how to deal with China, so that's why the different approaches are useful. Now, and I would say that Indo-Pacific strategy of the EU, I mean, one cannot look in isolation because one has to look starting from 2016, the global strategy, and also looking at the Europe-Asia connectivity, global gateway, and also economic security strategy. So if I put together all these things together, so it means what European approach would be. One, that the focus on the Indo-Pacific would be increasing in the coming years. And Europe is already a very significant economic presence they have. And it's also being felt very clearly in Europe that geopolitical competition is also becoming intense. And centrality of ASEAN is talked by India and also by Europe. So the major focus of Europe has been how to really advance economic interest further and how to protect value chains, critical minerals, etc. So earlier, in fact, in the beginning, the EU's and some of the key member states' approach towards China was somewhat ambivalent, but now it's very clear. China is very much part of the Indo-Pacific as far as Europe is concerned. In fact, the EU strategy is Indo-Pacific strategy is about EU strategy for cooperation. And EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, in the last Indo-Pacific forum, he said about strategy for cooperation and inclusiveness. In fact, when you look at the figures which are being quoted all the time by most of the European speeches, policy maker speeches, and also in all the approaches, when you say that Indo-Pacific is half of the world's population, 50% of the world GDP, 60% of the global trade, etc., it means you are including China. It's not against China. China is very much part of the Indo-Pacific. And this is understandable because both China and EU are, global economic heavyweights. Both they have important role in global governance institutions. Economically, they are deeply engaged with each other. And you have, close to $1 trillion trade in goods and services together. So it means, when we talk about everybody, in fact, India also talks about inclusivity. But European Indo-Pacific approach is actually truly inclusive in that sense that you're also including China into this. So it means the conversations within Quad and in some of the other forums in India, their base idea is to build some kind of collective platform against assertive China. So India, the EU is also worried about China, as we can see from many of the, the recent statements from many people. But it doesn't want to be part of the geopolitical competition within the Indo-Pacific region. So it sincerely favors inclusive Indo-Pacific, in which, as I said, the China is very much part of this narrative. So in that context, we really need to have more and more conversations between India and the EU. Mr. Vigand have very clearly, kind of outlined what the Indo-Pacific strategy is. It's really, really comprehensive. The engagement is going to be on democracy, rule of law, human rights, 2030 Agenda and Paris Agreement, and then all these priority areas, 6 or 7, which they have been mentioned. So now there are two issues when we look at the very comprehensive kind of and economic-centric approach of Europe. So, it was, to some extent, it was already quite a fluid concept of the Indo-Pacific with all the different geographies, etc. And the in one way, the European approach has the potential to confuse the concept further. But at the same time, this approach also shows some way how to engage with China economically and balance it strategically. Now, within this EU strategy, the India was mentioned actually twice. One in the context of restarting FTA, and second, building connectivity partnership. Now, both the things are already happening. Connectivity partnership and has been established, and then FTA negotiations are on, and we also have trade and technology consent, as was mentioned. So they are also planning to work in third countries, at least in principle it has been agreed. So there are different approaches in that sense. I would say the way India and Quad looks at, even if they talk about inclusivity, but the European approach in that sense is really comprehensive, focusing more how to really engage with China, how to work with China. As we speak, the German Chancellor was already in China, and the President Xi Jinping would be visiting France and many other countries in Europe. So there is all kind of conversations are going on between Europe and China, how to really work together as a partner. But of course, they are worried about many other issues, which we are all quite aware. So these are the kind of, I think, conversations which are going on. But at large level, as I said, there are in the last 10, 15 years, as I've been following India, EU, I mean, it's really very extensive partnership which has been built between India and Europe. And Indo-Pacific narrative has also brought India and EU very close together, despite the fact that Indian perceptions about Ukraine have been different. So this is the way I think things are evolving. We can discuss many other things in detail in Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bhushan, for the initial talk and for highlighting, amongst other things, that the key component of this strategy that we see replicated with other countries is also the idea of how to deal with the rise of China. That seems to be the central element here. I want to throw this question actually back at and start a new round of a conversation here back to Gunnar, and to see a little bit of your view, Gunnar, on this idea that at the end of the day, the Indo-Pacific strategy is also a way for the European Union to frame its position towards the rise of China. And if I may as well, to add another question to you. You mentioned the idea of the word presence at some point in your initial talk, right? And in a way that member states such as Germany and France are having even a military presence, right, by participating in military exercises in the region and with partners in the Indo-Pacific. And presence seems to be one of the key elements of this strategy. How can, in your view, that be assured in practice, right? We know that, as Julia said, the region is far away. There's, of course, plenty of commercial ties and political partnerships and some security cooperation. But how can presence be ensured in practice in a way that is also sustainable? I also have a question, perhaps it's for both Julia and Gunnar, with regards to ASEAN. That was mentioned by, I believe, all three of you. And we know that ASEAN, well, with all of its members, it's quite a comprehensive organization that, of course, does not include neither China nor India, right? But it's a major channel of EU's interaction with the region. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the role that ASEAN and the interaction with ASEAN play into this big picture of the EU approach to the region, and if we see initiatives that are promising in that regard as well. Specifically to Julia. Julia, you mentioned that, of course, there are like-minded partners like Australia, like Japan, like South Korea, and of course, well, Taiwan. I think we can add. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the Philippines as well. I know that the U.S. Many high-ranking U.S. diplomats have been talking to that country, right? It's one of the countries that has been most voiceful against China's maritime claims in the region, right? And I wonder where we would put the EU's interaction with the Philippines in the sort of categories that you mentioned before. And if you can also further expand on, since you mentioned NATO, right? How would the partnership with the United Kingdom actually fit in this whole network of partners and like-minded and rivals and so on? We of course have the partnership of AUKUS, right? That excludes the European Union, but includes the United Kingdom, right? It plays a big role in the region. So I wonder if you can elaborate a bit more on that. And for Gulshan, picking up on what you said with regards to a lot of the Indo-Pacific strategy being also a way to, of course, manage the rise of China and the unified Western position towards that. How would the most recent expansion of the BRICS fit into that picture, right? And many are saying that this expansion is mostly an addition of countries that end up siding with China, or sort of going into its zone of into its orbit, right? How is it perceived in India, right? And how does that fit into, let's say, the Indo-Pacific strategy that we see from the United States, but also from the European Union? If you can pick up on those questions, I suggest we do the same order. We are also starting to get a few questions by the Q&A button, but I suggest we do this first round. So back to you, Gunnar, with your reflections as well. Please unmute yourself.
You have bombarded us with so many questions that we can't fill the next 2 hours with the answers. So I will try to be very telegraphic. Of course, that the rise of China and its global ambition to be the new number one, to be the new hegemonic power, is in the back of the minds of everybody who deals with this region. And the question is whether this Indo-Pacific strategy is now a means to this or not. When I see that India is member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and this is together with Russia and China, it's probably a means of cooperating with China in a number of areas. When I see that India is member of BRICS, together with Russia and China and Brazil, it's also a means of cooperating with China, even though India has, of course, very important direct security concerns with regard to China. So it's not that we are living in an either-or world, and this applies as well to the United States, which tries to manage its competition under the Biden administration with China. And I think that when having studied the start of the Indo-Pacific strategies with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's first initiative taken up by the Australians, taken up by the Indians, Prime Minister Modi in Singapore in 2018, there's always these two motivations. One is a strategic motivation, how to contain China, and the other one is an economic motivation, how to mitigate geopolitical rivalry, how to avoid mutually exclusive choices. And I think in the case of the European Union, as well as several other players, and ASEAN certainly, there is a bit of both. But it's not a containment strategy for China, indeed. It is therefore having these words inclusivity and cooperation. But I also can tell you that China is not at all interested in the Indo-Pacific cooperation framework. China is interested to cooperate bilaterally with the EU or in wider international frameworks such as the G20. So yes, it's an element of motivation, but no, it is not the purpose of this strategy. I would also like to inform you that, of course, at any of the Indo-Pacific Ministerial Fora, while we had prominent Japanese, Indian, Korean, and other partners' participation, that includes, by the way, Pakistan, we did not have any Chinese participation. Second point is how to ensure the security presence. Well, I did point to our existing operation at the Horn of Africa. We did agree on a new coordinated maritime presence of the naval forces as they go through the Indian Ocean, which means not only exchange of information between them, but also joint port calls, joint exercises with different navies. And this allows cooperation with quite a number of different partners. We have also under negotiation security partnerships with Japan and with Korea, I would like to state, as a result of the last summits with them. And we have critical maritime routes cooperation for coast guards and navies with regard to the possibilities for cooperation between them in very practical terms. And also support for exchange between practitioners from counterterrorism to maritime security to crisis management to cybersecurity. These are a few examples, but perhaps the more important, let's say, progress, and I think the assessment which Julia talked about, the assessment should always about what are the practical results. The fact that we have resumed negotiations with India on an FTA, but also with Thailand and also with the Philippines, and that we are including more into economic partnership agreements from East Africa, but also from the Pacific, that we have digital partnerships with several partners in the region, including binding digital trade principles. So in each of the areas, we have the huge Samoa Agreement with all the countries of the Pacific, with a special Pacific protocol agreed and finally signed in November. We have new partnership cooperation agreements with Malaysia and Thailand. We joined the Indian Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative earlier this year. So these are all concrete elements. And one thing is clear, that on security, if we have critical security challenges in our immediate neighborhood, they will always have the preference over the engagement in the Indo-Pacific. That's a fact of life. Having said this, I think it was High Representative Borrell who said we are geographically far away, but we are economically, we are a neighborhood for each other because of the great importance of our trade investment. And we see what disruptions can create in terms of economic havoc. So we have therefore also every interest in the security of our supply chains. And I leave the question answering ASEAN to colleagues, but just to say, ASEAN is now not only a strategic partner, but we also had our first summit in this time, and the engagement has further deepened. Thank you.
Thank you, Gunnar. In the interest of time, on to you, Julia, with the questions of ASEAN, but also, the UK, Philippines, and the many others I bombarded you with.
Yes, I mean, you are aware that there is no way I can respond to all these questions now, like in 1 minute. And I think Gunnar already expanded on many of those. I will just maybe just say that in terms, again, you assess the success or the not so success of an initiative by looking at the initial objectives. So my whole point was, I think that if we look at the initial objectives of the further engagement with the Indo-Pacific region for Europe, I think this can be considered a success in a sense that it survived several other crises, even in the neighborhood. And it's also, and I think this will be more or less my response, it's also showing like an evolution. So it's adapting to the context that is changing, and is changing very rapidly. And in this sense, one way to show this evolution is to also adapt the cooperation with the different partners and use the different frameworks and the different groupings in a useful way, depending on what they can bring to the table. So in this sense, cooperation and discussion at a NATO level, for example, is useful because in a sense force all partners to discuss certain issues in that specific context. But the fact that things are discussed there, the fact that Russian invasion of Ukraine is discussed with partners from the Indo-Pacific in a NATO context is already a sign that Europe is engaging with the regions on different fronts. Then there are different ways and different level of engagement, of course. And I mean, we know very well we cannot and we should not aspire to a one-fit-all approach, right? So there are countries with whom we will cooperate in certain ways because we are Europe and we are not US. There are other countries with whom we will feel more at ease and going a step further and have a more a deeper cooperation because we think the time is right, because we think we are aligned on several elements. We see things in a similar way. So this is part of the evolving approach that Europe has on the Indo-Pacific region. And just quickly trying to respond to that, ASEAN is part of that. ASEAN has been traditionally the main point of contact of Europe because being a regional organization is the natural partner for that. But the European Union is also evolving this discussion now, how to keep this cooperation going in face of all these challenges. This is where we will really need to keep an eye in the next months and years, in a sense. ASEAN and ASEAN member states not always aligned with Europe on some of the recent crises. So this, of course, poses a challenge for the cooperation. But how this will be overcome, I think it's gonna be interesting. And I'll probably conclude here just by saying again that in terms of final assessment, it's really interesting to notice this adaptation. And to conclude with what Gunnar said, the fact that the region is perceived as a priority now for Europe, that's already a main an important objective that has been reached, because it is important. It's important for the security, for the economic security element. So we should indeed remain involved and try to avoid this idea that Europe very often had of we need to focus on one crisis instead of the other. We are looking at immediate issues and not try to look a bit more long term, and always work, in different and set the world in different regions. That now in 2024, as the COVID-19 pandemic proved, as the war in Ukraine proved, is not necessarily the best approach Europe can have. And I'll stop here because we see there are questions as well.
Thank you very much, Julia. Goshen, let me just add a couple more questions that appear in the Q&A here for you as well. That one from Professor Kilculator here from KU11, who asks, how is the EU specific strategy perceived by Indian officials and diplomats? Is it, and I quote, is it of any importance for India's foreign policy? And we also have a question from Andres Sanchez from UNICRIS here close to us in Bruges, who asks about the role of SAARC, right? So the South Asia region organization in there. I mean, I think there's an interesting comparison to be made perhaps with ASEAN. I wonder if you could also tackle those two questions in your what's I would say.
Yeah, thank you. No, I mean, as far as official, I would say the way it has been perceived in India, obviously, I mean, they have welcomed, all the Indo-Pacific strategies, although India has not really released any Indo-Pacific strategy per se. In fact, you have to put together many of the statements and speeches together to figure out what is India's Indo-Pacific strategies, because normally Indian government, or not just only Indo-Pacific, on many other issues also, they don't really issue any strategy. That's what they do. So it has been definitely very kind of positive, welcome, I would say, development, which has been perceived very, very positively in India, which they have announced in so many statements at different forums. Now, I totally agree with Vigen that we are not really living in a either-or kind of world. Because you mentioned about BRICS and SCO. India has also been very, I would say, seriously participating in both these forums as well, where China's dominated kind of SCO, and also you also have the BRICS, where at least now with the expansion of BRICS, now so many other countries are coming. So now, if you look at specifically, you asked question about BRICS. No, there have been so many meetings, so many statements, and all the big, almost everything is covered under the sun if you read all the statements. But two major achievements so far they had. One was the establishment of the new development bank, and secondly, this contingent reserve arrangement of $100 billion, which at any kind of contingency, any BRICS countries could kind of borrow from that. Although in fact, most of the BRICS countries, they didn't have to borrow because they have enough foreign exchange reserves at the moment. So if you look at, because in India, I think we'll continue to work with all countries, including with China. In fact, if you look at, even despite all the tensions at the border, the latest interview to Newsweek by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So when the question was asked about China, and he doesn't talk much about China in most of his. In fact, all the statements are from other ministers or at the official level. So then I think his answer was that situation needs to be addressed urgently, particularly at the border. So all the abnormality in our relationship so we can put the abnormality because behind, so we can start working constructively in a sense, which was the case just few years back when we had a very important meeting with the President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, both in China and also in India. So many things are happening, many things are possible even on the India-China front. And if you look at the current, I would say, expansion of BRICS, if you look at the new members which have been inducted in BRICS, you have Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, and the others. This is very clearly, I would say, uh, Middle East centric and oil centric or energy centric. Because all these members, if you put together, today, if you look at 10 major producers of oil today, 6 or 7 are this now in the new BRICS, and many of those Iran is under sanctions, Russia is under sanctions, and many of them are trading with each other, and many of those trading arrangements are happening bilaterally with the local currencies or with the third country currencies, as is happening between China and Russia, as is happening between India and Russia, and also it used to happen between India and Iran. And so India is using, UAE currency to pay. India is also using, perhaps the reports are also the Chinese currency to pay some of the things, and maybe some other currency. So, I think and in fact, large number of countries, as you know, particularly from the global south, they have also applied for the membership of the BRICS. So, there was always certain amount of interest was in BRICS from other countries. But I think what has happened in the last 2 years, after the way the Western countries have weaponized the whole the global financial system, there are certain worries about all these countries that if this can happen today to Russia, it can also happen tomorrow to some other countries as well. So now what they're doing within BRICS, at least, of course, even if there are certain geopolitical worries between India, China, and other things, but still within the BRICS, I think at least on certain commodities, like oil, they are still trying to figure it out that they can have some kind of alternative mechanism to payments. This has already been happening bilaterally or with third country currencies within the BRICS, but this can also have a BRICS level kind of mechanism. So many of those kind of discussions are happening, and it may lead to some kind of mechanism at some point, because these things do happen, it does take time. And similar thing, on some areas, India continued to be member of the BRICS and participating in whether you look at particularly on the energy and trade or those kind of issues. So those India, this has been working, and as you know, India-Russia relations, of course, are very, very, very special, I would call it. And that has been continuing despite the fact that India has developed its own relations, very close relations with the United States and also with Europe and with many other countries as well. So this is the way, the world in which we are living. And that's why, in fact, I like in that sense the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. Because, compared to many of the other ideas about Indo-Pacific, which they focus on immediate security or those kind of issues, which keeps changing, those political issues, because what is happening today between India and China after 5 years, it may be different. What is happening between China and the United States, it can change. We do not know what's going to happen. But at the same time, this region is going to be important economically. That's quite clear to everyone. And China is continued to be very important country. Whatever the little slowdown happens or not. And this is the kind of way I think the Europe has looked at how to deal with China, that you continue to working with China at the same time, how do you really protect your certain security interests? So I would say the way, I think the long term, and of course the sustainability issues, I think others really don't talk too much about those climate and other issues, which Europe has really put together in the Indo-Pacific strategy, connectivity issues, all these other issues as well. So I would say that in the long term, maybe some other approaches to the Indo-Pacific also would look towards more positively toward the way I think the Europe has looked at, depending on how the geopolitics, evolves. If it's too concentrated on anti-China or too much geopolitical tensions between the US and China, of course, many things would be sidelined. But if there is a certain kind of cooperative mechanism in certain areas between the US and China and between India and China, I think we are looking at a very different kind of world. So we do not know. Things are very uncertain. Things are evolving. And every day, as we have seen in the last 3 years, because even about China, the European suspicions about China has increased in the last couple of years. It wasn't the case 5-7 years ago. Now, after Ukraine war, the way I think the Russia and China are working together, the worries are even more. So things are evolving, but in what way this will evolve, it's uncertain. But I think the way Europe has looked at Indo-Pacific, I think there is a lot of value to look at this approach, and also we need much more conversations between Indo-Pacific countries and also between India and the European Union, that we can really understand each other's, perceptions and priorities better.
Thank you very much, Gulshan. I'm glad we can finish on this more optimistic note as well. And I'm very glad that we could bring this topic to the discussion table today, because as all three of you said, this connects with so many other policy elements in European external action, transatlantic relations, the approach towards the Middle East and the energy crisis, and so on and so forth. And of course, will be of extremely importance going ahead, even in of course, the very, very long term of external action, the EU. I'm afraid we're running out of time. There's a few questions that
there was one question about SARC. If I just answer in half a minute, I don't know what exactly, there was a question about SARC, but I think SARC is one regional organization which hasn't really worked. And if you look at particularly from Indian perspectives, even if, because at the moment the intra-regional trade within South Asia is just only about 5 to 6%. And even if by hypothetically, if everything is perfect between India and Pakistan, because that's one kind of stumbling block that we know that it hasn't really worked well. So even then, I think it's not going to be more than 8 or 9% of the regional trade within South Asia. So what is really another thing in the process, what is happening is in the last 10 years or so, India also used to think that the South Asian area, which is an area of kind of Indian economic sphere of influence. India used to have, India was, number one trading partner except Pakistan of almost every country in this region. But that has changed in the last 10 years or so, since 2007 or 8, I would say things are changing. Now, China has become number one trading partner of almost all countries except perhaps Bhutan or Nepal. And even India's, China trade has also really grown, despite all the talk of de-risking, decoupling. Nobody, now even the United States and US and the Europe all have abundant decoupling now. We're talking about de-risking, but de-risking is also very risky business, because it means if you start de-risking, the other partner will also start de-risking from you. So then, we are getting into a different kind of game. So how do you really integrate this region? That's much more important in the long run. And whether you like it or not, China for the last 20, 30 years has been the center of this global value chains. So how do you really move away without even abandoning China? That's what actually the major challenge for everyone is, and how India should really project itself with all its policies, which India has been very, very cautious in the last many years. India also moved out from the RCEP at the last minute. So India has to move. Obviously, the idea is here looking much beyond SARC. Either India has been working bilaterally with some of the countries, or of course linking more with other Asian countries in Southeast Asia and East Asia. The SARC is, I think, more or less is a really sad story. It hasn't really worked, and there's very little future one can see the way the politics is at the moment here within SARC.
Thank you, Gulshan. Well, I wanted to finish on a positive note, but since now I mentioned SARC, I think that will not be possible. But jokes apart, this has been very, very insightful. This recording, the recording of this section will be available on the Engage website. There you can already find recorded webinars on topics such as the EU's strategic compass, energy security, trade and geoeconomics, the most recently one on transatlantic relations, precisely with the upcoming elections in the US. By the way, we're going to have upcoming elections now. We have elections now in India, right, starting next week. It's very important to take note of that as well. Our next Engage webinar is in 2 weeks' time. We're going to delve into the EU's space policy and its security turn. You can already register to that webinar by visiting the Engage website. Thank you very much, Professor Gulshan Sachdeva, Professor Gunnar Viega, and Professor Julia Turkovic. We appreciate your participation today, and hope we can have further such conversations in the future. And until then, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.